Hi, everybody. I'm Sandy Ansari, educational therapist, and I'm here with you again to interview a public thinker that I find useful for teachers and parents. So today we have Dr. Steuart Shanker, who is a distinguished research professor emeritus of philosophy and psychology at York University, CEO of the Merit Center, and science director of the Self-Regulation Institute. An internationally celebrated speaker, thinker, and writer, and one of the world's leading authorities on self-regulation, the cornerstone of my work as an educational therapist. Trained intensively in child psychotherapy under Stanley Greenspan, one of my favorites. Dr. Shanker was the director of the Milton and Ethel Harris Research Initiative at York University and president of the Canadian Council of Early Child Development and the director of the Council of Human Development. Over the past decade, Dr. Shanker has served as an advisor on early child development to government organizations across Canada, the United States, and Australia, where he served as the 2012 Thinker in Residence for Western Australia. In Canada, he's assisting in kindergarten through grade 12 self-reg initiatives in school jurisdictions across the country. A best-selling author, one of his many books, Calm, Alert, and Learning, Classroom Strategies for Self-Regulation, we have right here. And Self-Regulation, How to Help Your Child and You Break the Stress Cycle and Engage with Life, 2016. And his most recent book, Reframed, Self-Reg for a Just Society, 2020. Welcome, Dr. Shanker.
Thank you, Sandy.
So I was originally going to sort of talk with you more about self-reg, how to help your child and you break the stress cycle. But in the interim of our last appointment to this one, I delved into reframed.
Okay.
And at the same time, the new Geppetto and Pinocchio story came out, which I saw in one of your chapters you went into, and I thought we could use that sort of as a theme throughout our discussion.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about just the basic terms of what self-regulation is for the audience?
Well, there's a kind of interesting history to my own work in this area. I was trained in Oxford, and what I was working on there was self-regulation from basically the beginning of the 20th century up to artificial intelligence, so around the 1960s. It began as a physiological definition that was, it traces back to the work of Claude Bernard in the 19th century, but it was made famous by Walter Bradford Cannon. And really what it refers to is how we manage stress. Maybe we can talk a little bit about this later, but Cannon envisaged essentially 5 levels of self-regulation. So at the bottom, we call it the neural axis, and at the bottom of the neural axis, there are self-regulating mechanisms in the brainstem. So to give you an easy example, in the medulla oblongata, it monitors our oxygen saturation in the bloodstream. And we like to keep it, between 97 and 100%. If the oxygen levels drop below 94%, the medulla oblongata triggers a reaction where we end up breathing faster and deeper so that we can take in more oxygen. So for Cannon, this is a very basic self-regulating mechanism buried deep in the human brain. And as we go up the neural axis. So sitting above that is the midbrain, and I think you and I are going to talk about that a bit later. And then above that is the diencephalon, which is hugely important because of the hypothalamus, which we sort of regard as the master self-regulating mechanism. And then above that sits what we call the limbic system, and then above that, the prefrontal cortex. Now, or the neocortex, but in particular, the prefrontal. When people talk about self-regulation, they really are only talking about the top level, the things that we learn, the things that we do. So I'll give you an example. It's very cold where I live, and I have an 18-year-old son who had to take a pet into the vet today and came downstairs. It's -11, just so for context.
Oh, wow.
And he came downstairs wearing a t-shirt and shorts and sandals. So I had to explain very gently to my 18-year-old that he really needed to put on a sweater, pants, socks, and boots. And that's a learned mode of self-regulation, because what we have learned is that, with protective clothing, we reduce the amount of energy the body has to spend to keep itself warm, to keep body temperature of around 98.6. And so that's the key to self-regulation. And the idea is, for people that are new to this way of thinking, we have non-conscious self-regulating mechanisms in the brain, and we have conscious learned self-regulating behaviors that hopefully our parents have instilled in us. When I came to Canada in '84, I had published some things about self-regulation, about this view, and someone an editor at Education Canada asked me to respond to what other people were saying, and in particular, the government of Ontario, which had just put a box on self-regulation in the report card for children in primary, and it was a sort of pass or fail. Does the teacher had to tick? Does this child self-regulate or not self-regulate? Which for me was a little more bizarre, because the brain self-regulates. We self-regulate even in the womb, but especially when we're born, we have all these self-regulating mechanisms. So I started to read what the research on which the government had based this, and they were all treating self-regulation as a form of self-control. So they would ask questions like, can the child regulate their emotions? Can the child regulate their attention? And they regulate their behavior. What they really meant was control. And for me, this was, well, to say the least, very odd, because self-regulation is not a pass-fail kind of thing. But I understood where they were coming from. The very word regulation comes from the Latin regula, meaning you use a ruler to draw a straight line. So their idea was you use some faculty of the mind, like willpower, to regulate your emotions or your attention. This, I was very concerned about this. For one thing, my first son is on the spectrum, and he has all sorts of problems self-regulating in the physiological sense, because he has so many stresses in his life, and he would easily become overstressed. So I wanted to explain that self-regulation is really about how much stress a child is under, and what causes that child to become dysregulated, for systems to become unable to keep up with the stress load. and how this shows up in their behavior, or, in their emotions, we'll say. And for me, this was without doubt the reason why I was so drawn to Stanley Greenspan, because the behaviors were just a sign that this child is dysregulated, not that the child doesn't have strong enough willpower to control their emotions or control their behavior, but rather that because of the excessive stress load, and a very important point, maladaptive ways of dealing with that, maladaptive modes of self-regulation, the child was in chronic homeostatic imbalance, what we call cacostasis. So for me, DIR or Stan, that was a godsend, because it really pointed me on the path to the how. How do we return this child to homeostasis? So that's a short history of where it all came from.
Wow. So you used a lot of your personal experience.
Yeah.
But I also understand that the term self-regulation was starting to be used as kind of a wastebasket explanation.
Yeah.
And
That's a good term. That's a very good term.
Yeah. And so it just, teachers who want to find a way of monitoring self-regulation were using that as a rule of thumb, which is understandable, but it's so much more complex, apropos the sort of 5 domains that you go over. But all in all, there's a fight or flight response. There's a stress response. Really, you're sort of bringing us back to how all humans, not just children on the spectrum, experience stress and how they manage. I'm not even sure if manage is the right word. How they experience stress and respond to stress.
Geez, Sandy, there's so much in what you just said. We could spend a couple of hours unpacking it all. I love the term that you used. It becomes a wastebasket for behaviors that the teacher will say finds irritating, or even makes them angry. And so what happens is they end up exacerbating the child's stress, for example, by yelling or by punishing. Now, let's go back to my kid this morning. It was a very interesting experience. So here he is, he's about to go out. And by the way, the reason you get sick is because you've used up so much of your energy trying to stay warm that the immune system is compromised. So if I said to him, in a stern voice, go upstairs and put on your clothes, for sure we would. By the way, this son has severe ADHD. So if I'd said that to him, without question, he would have gone what we call red brain. He would have been hyper aroused. And the problem now is that when the child is hyper aroused, they can't actually process what you're saying. And in fact, the very systems in the prefrontal cortex that support self-control are turned off. The medial prefrontal is turned off. So it's not even possible. And so what we want to do is we want to bring that kid back into balance. And the way I did it was I said to him, I'm having a bit of a hard day. I could really use a hug. Now, I don't know if we'll get into this later or not. I hope we do. But essentially what I was doing was the skin-to-skin contact triggers a neurochemical that turns off the stress response. And now I could feel, and this is a point that Stan would make over and over to parents, I could feel him coming back to balance. I could feel the tension subsiding. And now I could say, it's really cold outside. Why don't you go upstairs and put on a sweater and pants? Which he did. So it took all of 1 minute to avoid escalating, avoid really, in a way, harming him. Now, there's a second part of what you said that needs to be unpacked a little. One of the things that Cannon himself, Walter Cannon, emphasized was fight or flight. In fact, he was the one who came up with this. And not surprisingly, we have found that when people talk about the reptilian brain, the so-called reptilian brain or the lizard brain, they go straight to fight or flight. But I noticed that in your questions, which we will get to, you asked me about Jaak Panksepp. And what Panksepp showed was that fight or flight is just one of the reptilian functions. And he had 7 what he called primitive emotion circuits. And these are essentially 7 self-regulating systems deep in the midbrain. And so fight or flight is just one aspect of what happens when the gray brain, the bottom of the brain, the midbrain, the brainstem are running the show. This model explains, for example, bullying. What happens when homeostatic imbalance causes what's called predatory aggression, and essentially you don't see another child or someone else as a human being. You see them as prey. It's a very, very important model. And so what we want to stress is we're not just talking about stress. Stress is a part of life. A child is bathed in stress from the moment of birth. And bear in mind, the definition I gave a couple of minutes ago: stress is anything that requires us, it triggers a physiological response that burns energy to restore homeostasis. But stress can be invigorating. We have that nice little stress curve that Yerkes-Dodson, that's the beginning of modern psychology, that stress up to a certain point is helpful, enhances performance. It's when it goes past that midpoint of the inverted U curve that performance degrades substantially and we see problems. So the issue here is not stress. Stress is not inherently aversive. It's the homeostatic imbalance that is in the midbrain caused by excessive stress, which is aversive. That's how we're designed. Can I just add one thing to this, Andy, and then I'll pause? It's a very interesting question here. So we say that homeostatic imbalance, what does that mean? Well, it could mean being hungry. That's homeostatic imbalance. We feel hunger, and we can explain all the hormones. Thirsty, that's a homeostatic imbalance. Lonely, that's a homeostatic imbalance. In fact, we discovered in 2019, this is a very recent discovery, that there are a special class of dopamine social neurons in the midbrain, in the dorsal raphe nucleus, that when we are alone, they are activated. It's very unpleasant, driving us back into social interaction. And clearly that was designed by evolution. We don't have a chance on our own. So what I wanted to stress here was we can have all these different, and I'll make the point now. So we can have all these different kinds of homeostatic imbalance, social, hunger, and so on, sex. And when there's a homeostatic imbalance, it is aversive. Okay. So we know that children find certain emotions aversive and they'll avoid them. Every kid's going to have a couple of emotions that they suppress. But the interesting question for me was, what does that mean? It's aversive. Why is it aversive? And here's the answer.
Okay.
Homeostatic imbalance triggers, activates nociceptive neurons, pain neurons.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't
Pain
it?
neurons.
Pain neurons, yeah, or nociceptive, which is a precursor of pain. And now let's go back to my older son. So because he was in chronic homeostatic imbalance, he was in constant pain. Constant pain, as anybody listening to this knows who's had it, is incredibly draining. It's a constant it's a constant drain on our energy. It sends us deep into what we call the bottom right of the Thayer matrix, and you can share that with your viewers. You can get a free copy from Susan.
Okay.
So my poor kid was in this heightened pain state, and going to school, he was encountering adults, teachers, who were telling him, suppress your pain. That's essentially what they were saying. Block your pain. Don't give in to your pain. They were adding to his pain. They were adding to his imbalances. But all it takes is a gentle voice, a gentle hand, maybe a hug. It's not hard to turn off the nociceptive neurons, and we'll get to that, I hope. So one of the reasons why I agreed to do this with you is because we want, so I read your background, and we want all of these therapists and clinicians that you train, we want them to get the word out. We want the whole society to understand that if you can turn off this kindled pain system, you are going to see a different kid. You are going to see a wonderful kid, and it will always be the case.
Wow. Powerful message. Yet kind of simple, but hard for parents to let go of, parents and teachers to let go of their sort of ideals or their,
Yep.
as we say, ghost in the nursery, how they were trained or brought up as a child. It can definitely influence.
I love it. I love it. I love the expression. It's very good.
Yes. So this homeostatic dysregulation or kind of shock, it's almost as though there's like different parts of the brain are offline, while other ones are just kind of like overactive.
Okay, let's run with that for a second. Okay. You're right. So we know what's overactive. Okay, so we can say now that the limbic system, that the amygdala is overactive, or we can, but what's offline? That's a really interesting term. And the things that are offline are the parts of the brain that support attention, that support problem solving,
reality testing,
self-awareness. And that's very, very important. And what it means is that the child is not aware of the aversive sensations that the gray brain is sending up because of the homeostatic imbalance. How is that possible? Well, let's give you an example. The son this morning was under a huge amount of stress. And end of year, end of term, he's trying to get things done. And the stress was so high that he did not feel the cold. That's huge. So now what happens is, so we have some really interesting research on this. We know that in reunion, so by hugging, what was happening was I was triggering. Can I stick with the neurochemicals?
Yes.
Or is
yes.
it?
No, good.
So in reunion, we know that it triggers
Oxytocin.
It does trigger oxytocin. I didn't want to talk about that now.
Okay.
We can talk about oxytocin in a couple of minutes,
Okay.
but you're right, it does. And that's huge. But it triggers, and the question why it's huge is really, really interesting. But it triggers beta endorphins. And so what happens is you start to tune in to your sensations, your awareness comes back, you feel the cold. And, there's a really great example of this. Why do we overeat? Well, we know why we eat. We know that eating gives us all these sedating effects. We get a nice shot of dopamine. Dopamine drives eating. But all of nature, we're the only species that overeats, except I once had a beagle and it overate. So I don't want to overgeneralize here. If you leave a beagle get too much food, they will eat till death. But with us, we are stress eating. Everybody knows what that is. But all animals, including us, have a really finely calibrated homeostatic system that stops us or them from overeating. So if you do experiments with rats, which is where most of this is done, they'll stop eating. They have receptors that tell them when they have enough energy. And if they start to go past that point, it produces in them and in us neurochemicals, in this case, ghrelin, which stop it. These neurochemicals are, this feeling of overeating is aversive. Okay. So we have an unpleasant sensation, which is designed to stop us from going into having excessive energy in the bloodstream. But we continue to overeat. Why? And so I can't remember now when this started, but everyone says, well, you lack willpower. And that's utter nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
Willpower has nothing to do with why we overeat. What happens is if we are excessively stressed, we aren't, and this is the kid, this is us, we aren't aware of the aversive sensations. We literally don't feel them. They're being triggered, the ghrelin's being triggered, but we don't register it.
Offline. It's offline.
Exactly. And I love the way you put it. And so, like I find, I'll give you a really interesting example. I'm a vegetarian. And so I went through a period where I ate meat because my wife's doctor said she needed certain amino acids. And I never liked it. And I would eat, say, steak or whatever it was, and not really like it. But I still ate it, which is really weird. But what had happened was, like everybody, I had a lot of stress in my life and I ignored the signals. I suppressed the signals until finally, through an unfortunate combination of events, I had no choice but to go back to being vegetarian. And now I find that I'm so tuned into this. The very thought of eating meat, I find a little bit repulsive. So it's really interesting how excessive stress blunts our awareness. Now, if you've got a kid on the spectrum, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So with my older son, he never knew when he was hungry, never knew when he was cold, never knew, and I can go on and on, didn't know when he was tired. And in those states, what would happen was, so we'll take the fatigue as a very interesting example. So he would get tired, and let's go a little older now. So say 9, 10, 11. So when he was tired, and this applies to every parent, his brain naturally directed him to get a shot of dopamine. Okay. So dopamine is not a reward. So that's just a mistake. Dopamine, we call it psychic energy. It gives us energy to go after something. And so we live in a world where businesses have capitalized on how to trigger dopamine. It's easy to do it. We've known that since the 1970s in psychology. And so the kid, like I remember walking in one day and he was glued to playing Candy Crush. Now, I don't know if you know what that is. It makes no sense. It's the stupidest game. It's the stupidest game ever invented. And he'd been playing it for hours. So there's no winning. There's nothing. So why? And the answer is, of course, that they have mastered how to keep the dopamine pumps running. Each new level, you trigger another dopamine, or you can buy weapons to get, or whatever. That's what we call a maladaptive mode of self-regulation. Why is it maladaptive? Because you're in an energy depleted state. And so what you're doing is you're looking to keep yourself going. So you're drawn to the dopamine trigger, the video game, junk food, whatever it is. It's maladaptive because you've done nothing to mitigate the stresses that put you into homeostatic imbalance to begin with. So what should you do? What should you do if you have this, if you're in this depleted state? The kid's in this depleted state. They're tired. They need energy. They've run out of fuel. What should they do? Well, obviously we have to reduce the stresses, figure out what those are. But we have to do something that you mentioned a second ago. We've got to trigger oxytocin. Because oxytocin, so it's a nice little neurohormone, a nice neurochemical. We call it the cuddle chemical. Mom gets a surge of oxytocin during labor, during breastfeeding. We know all that. But neurobiologically, what oxytocin does is it turns off stress neurons. It turns off the stress.
It turns them off. That's another function. Okay.
Probably its original function. That's what happens.
Okay.
You want to talk about that next?
Sure. Let's get into it.
Well, let me take a pause and see if you got any questions about all that.
No, I'm good. I'm following your train of thought, and I want to get into sort of the relationship-based aspect of co-regulation and the interbrain, which you've brought up. I think that does kind of lead us into.
Okay, so let's do it now. Okay. And I'll do it in terms of where I was heading anyways. Okay, so people should understand that over the last 10 years, we have made the most astonishing discoveries, advances, and it reinforces what we have known for a long time, but it adds a new level of understanding. So I'll explain what I mean. In the hypothalamus, okay, so just so everybody, we're all on the same page. The hypothalamus is in a part of the brain called the diencephalon. So you've got this neural axis, and at the bottom you've got brainstem, and then above that you've got midbrain, and above that you've got diencephalon, and then you've got the limbic system, and then you've got the neocortex. So the hypothalamus, we sort of refer to it as the master control system. It oversees the amount of water in the bloodstream, the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. It oversees energy homeostasis. It oversees, anyways, on and on and on. In the hypothalamus, there is what we call a nucleus. A nucleus is just a group of neurons. So first of all, we're talking about a little tiny part of the brain in the diencephalon. And then in this little tiny part of the brain, there is a tiny, tiny, tiny little nucleus. And it's called the periventricular nucleus, group of neurons. Remember the definition of stress. So stress is anything that requires us to burn energy to maintain homeostasis. So in self-reg, if they want to read that 2016 book, we have 5 domains of stress: biological, physical, emotion, cognitive, social, and prosocial. Okay, so all kinds of stress. A baby is bathed in stress. We have stress the moment the baby is born. The biggest single stress on a baby is probably light, because they're used to a very dark environment. And so light waves, photons, are these energy, a surge of energy hitting the skin that can easily overstress the baby. They're not used to this. If you can get hold of that video that we use in TMC of Michael Jr. Calming his baby down, his newborn. She's just been born and she's crying, and he calms her down with his voice. And that's very interesting for people to see. Okay. And the question is why, and that's what I'm going to explain. Okay, so we've got this tiny little nucleus that is activated for any stress. What does that mean? Well, we need energy. If stress is anything that requires us to burn energy, where is the energy going to come from? Well, we have glucose in our bloodstream, so we got to access that. And we have glucose in our fat cells. Our fat cells are our fuel depot, but they have to be accessed. They have to be released. And so these little neurons in the periventricular are activated by stress, and they release what's called corticotropin releasing factor. Now, if that rings a bell, that's because we now know that the stress response starts with CRF, starts with cortical, and then ends up with cortisol through a number of, okay, so this is the brain's way. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So this is the brain's way of responding to stress. I need energy because that's what stress is. So I'm going to release corticotropin releasing factor so that I can tap into my energy. But if we are bathed in stress, if everything, noise is a stress, light is a stress, people are a stress, all of these things are stresses, how do we not burn out? And here's the amazing part. In the PVN, in the periventricular, this tiny little nucleus, there are 2 groups of neurons. One group of neurons releases corticotropin releasing factor. The other group of neurons releases oxytocin. That's a holy cow. Wow. In this tiny little system.
And they're together. Okay.
And they're together. So that's what stops us from burning out. Now, okay, so what triggers the stress response? Well, we know that. Stress does. That's easy. What triggers the oxytocin? And the answer is we have tickle receptors, skin receptors, that when they are stroked, release oxytocin. So this is Marshall Klaus's great research, right? Put the baby on the mother's ventrum, and it crawls its way up to the breast. And what's happening in this is the baby is triggering, the newborn is triggering oxytocin, which turns off their stress, and it's triggering oxytocin in the mother, which turns off her stress.
Yeah, I once heard the term skin on skin is like
skin on skin,
brain on brain.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. And so you mentioned the term interbrain. And that's the crux of the interbrain. So I'll come back to that if we have time. Okay. So skin contact triggers oxytocin. Okay. Now, we now know, again, a very recent discovery, that sound, that low vocalizations are in fact a form of touch.
Sure.
Because what you're doing is you're caressing the eardrum,
Yes.
which releases oxytocin. In that
Wow.
video I mentioned with Michael Jr., so he doesn't touch the baby. Instead, his voice lowers. It's all automatic. He speaks in a soothing voice, and these low register vocalizations are caressing her eardrum, releasing oxytocin, turning off the stress response. So we have this innate neurochemical homeostatic system. Okay. And it tells us something really important about co-regulation. So I gave the example of, the older child or the youth that's seeking out a dopamine shot to keep going. And I said that was maladaptive. So what is the adaptive? What is the growth, the healthy way of regulating when you have so much stress? And the answer is, to begin with, mom and dad, primary caregiver. What we need is our brain. Yeah. Because we can't handle it on our own. So we need that extra brain now to trigger our oxytocin so that I can get back to homeostasis. But now we've made yet another discovery, and that is that when the stress is too great, when we are in kakostasis, dysregulated, the child will shun social interaction. The child will close into themselves. They are trying to block out. Think of Carly Fleischman trying to block out any form of stress. And so one of the wonderful things about DIR or flirt time is we do this very slowly. This is wonderful. There's a wonderful term in Spanish. We talk about doing it paulatinamente. So you follow the child's lead. You don't barge in and say, you need a hug. If you do that, right, you're going to send the child. That's exactly right. So what we're going to do is very slowly let the child feel our presence, use our eyes, soft eyes, use our soothing voice. We can literally feel the child's tension subsiding. Eventually, we will get to the point where that child will come to us for a hug.
Right. So the sensory system is this a friendly sensory environment.
Yes.
So that it's not over or understimulating for them with respect to all the senses. And that includes, eye contact, and with the DIR floor time model, getting at eye level, getting on the floor.
Yep. Exactly right. So, what we want parents to understand. I loved what you said a couple of minutes ago. Let's get rid of all of this baggage you're carrying around. What did you call it? The ghost in the nursery?
Yes.
It's a great term.
Yes.
Right. So let go of it. Let go.
I think it was a paper by Anna Freud and.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, or Dorothy Burlingham, her in the Hampstead Clinic, I believe, or the Warner series. That's where it was sort of came up, but.
Okay, so that's going to be your homework. That's going to be your homework for me. You're going to have to track that down and send it to me, okay?
Of course.
Yeah, so, they've heard self-control so many times that you think, okay, well, my kid, lacks willpower, lacks self-control, can't self-regulate. Okay, so we want to get rid of all that. Just let it go. And we want to reframe our child's behavior. We want to learn to distinguish between misbehavior and stress behavior. stress behavior is caused by homeostatic imbalance. So looking back on when my kid, my older boy is now 21, when he was growing up, did he ever misbehave? Well, yeah, of course. You know, little boy, of course he's going to test limits, but not very much. Really not very much. Deep down, he was a little sweetheart who wanted to please. But boy, he had a lot of stress behavior. And I had to learn, as I'm running a clinic, I'm learning his own highly individual, highly idiosyncratic signals telling me this is a stress behavior, not intentional. He may not even be conscious of it. It's caused. So I'll take my boy as an example. A very subtle one, but when he was overstressed, his face went very pale. He got very white. So I could tell when he was overstressed just by looking at him. I could hear it in his voice, see it in his eyes. And so you begin to learn when it's time to teach or instruct and when it's time to soothe. And, you know, if there was anything that I could tell parents that might listen to you, it's this. If you see your child differently, you will see a different child. It's as simple
Reframe.
Reframe, exactly. So we mentioned, okay, so I've been going on a bit here, but you mentioned the interbrain. Okay. So the short version of the interbrain, it's highly relevant to what we're talking about now. So the short version is that all children, all babies are born prematurely. Human babies are about 4 to 6 months premature. And the short reason for this is because their brain growth has sort of maxed out inside the womb, and so it explodes postnatally, and literally explodes, just this enormous burst of what's called synaptogenesis. So when we look, since about 1990, we've talked about the fetus outside the womb. So still a fetus, still incredibly in need of being kept warm, being kept fed, all those things. Utterly helpless. But if you want to talk about a fetus outside the womb, then what is going to take the place of the umbilical cord? If you want to say this baby is still fetal in many respects, okay, what is the umbilicus? And the answer is the interbrain. Now, there's a lot of precursors of the interbrain. It goes back to Dan Stern, Colin Trevarthen. The basic idea is there's a brain-to-brain hookup. There is a wireless, like a Bluetooth connection between the mother's limbic system and the baby's. The baby's prefrontal is still just, it's the part that's growing the most. So it's limbic to limbic connection. This has huge implications for all the work you do, because what it means is we don't infer what our baby is feeling. We don't interpret. We don't read the science. We feel. If we have this brain-to-brain hookup, we feel my baby's agitation or my baby's anxiety, whatever it is. It's a sensation. If we're working with a mom who doesn't feel it, then the question is why? And the answer is, we touched on it before, how awareness is shut down by excessive stress. if that caregiver is under excessive stress. And I would encourage everyone to look at one of the great books that Greenspan did, Infants in Multi-Risk Families, and the studies they did on attachment disorders, and how in case after case they found that the mother was so overstressed that she was not aware of the baby's whatever was troubling the baby. And so this solution was not to teach, it wasn't this blue brain exercise. The solution was to reduce her stress, to return her to homeostasis so that she could feel.
Yes.
Now we're going to flip this, because just as we feel what our baby is feeling, our baby feels what we are feeling. So if I am angry, if I am anxious, and now it could be a baby, it could be a child, or it could be an 18-year-old with ADHD. If I am irritated by his stupidity, then that's the message he would have heard. That's what he would have
Irritation.
felt. Irritation. Wouldn't matter
And
what
rejection, almost.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
I completely agree. So it wouldn't matter what I said, because deep inside his red brain, deep inside his limbic system, he is feeling that
Your rejection.
He is feeling, I love it. Yeah. So
And then causes the reaction to the sense of rejection, yeah, which is the sort of possible misbehavior.
So there's a chapter in, I love this chapter in Self-Reg. We had this case, I won't go into it now, they have to read the book. But it's a wonderful case where this mom had this wonderful symbiotic relationship with her child until the child hit 13. And now they were fighting for 2 hours every night. And so what the therapist did was, especially Eunice, working with the mom to get grounded this was a yoga mom. So getting the mom to go outside the room, do your breathing, your pranayama, get before you interact, so that the child feels your calmness. And the solution was very quick. So what we need parents to do is, this isn't just a cognitive shift. We're not deciding to, get rid of the ghost that's in the room. What we want to do is, when we do reframing, this is experiential. As we reframe, we feel. As we feel, you have to be calm to feel. And as we get calm, the child feels our calm. Calmness is simply the result of endogenous opioids. So what we're doing is, by calming, we are releasing these opioids that flow throughout the brain, throughout the body, everywhere. The child, at whatever age, will feel the same, will have the same neurochemical response. That's why they get calm. And that, I feel, is one of the keys to where your own society has to go, because this applies to the adult who is screaming that, I won't wear a mask, or, down with the libs, or whatever it is. But, okay, so, I don't want to say this, but you've regressed to the level of a 3-year-old. You are, and so what I have to do is, I'm not going to shout. I'm not going to punish. Well, in some cases you're going to have to punish, I think. But really, as a society as a whole, for God's sake, let's get back into homeostasis so that we can hear each other, so that we can communicate.
Well, there's also, the notion of transgenerational trauma too, if you want to
absolutely
on that, and that's actually the paper is The Ghost in the Nursery. And now that I recall her name, Selma Freiberg, 1975.
Oh, it's Selma Freiberg. Yeah.
Yes.
Good friend of Stanley.
What's that?
Good friend of Stanley.
Okay. Oh, there. Well, that explains a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. So, sometimes it's, the trauma that's just repeating
Yep.
itself.
Yep.
And I love how there's a science that explains
Yep.
the concept of the interbrain, and that there's a science that explains how one can actually practice as an adult, practice self-regulation so that they can help regulate their child. Unfortunately, though, there's sometimes, deeper traumatic events that, the parents override those. Even myself, let's say I have a 2-year-old, and if I lose sleep,
Yep.
then I'm much more likely to repeat an early
Yep.
traumatic experience in my own infancy
Yep.
onto my child.
Yep.
It doesn't matter how much I've read your books or know
Yep.
about self-regulation. If I'm compromised based on early trauma, and daily stress mixed with early trauma, then that's when it becomes difficult sometimes. But it's good to be able to sort of do a reset and recompose and reclaim. And when, again, I'm back in a regulated state, I can understand my own ghosts in the nursery and my own limitations and why I was stressed out as a parent that caused me to, trigger my child, let's say.
I only have one thing to add to that because it was really, really good. To what you said, I couldn't add anything. But I want everyone to understand that when we talk about reframing, we're not just talking about reframing the child's signals or the child's behaviors. We're talking about reframing our own behavior, reframing our own signals. So I'll use myself as an example. Last night, I woke up at around 2 a.m, and that was it for me for the night.
Mm.
So now what I could have done is, I suppose I could have taken a sleeping pill at that point or whatever. But I was lying in bed and I was thinking, okay, so why did I wake up? I want to reframe this. And it's telling me something. What's it telling me? Okay, so it's telling me that I'm overstressed. Why am I overstressed? And that wasn't so hard for me to figure out. The point is to start to learn what my own little signals are so that I can reframe, so that I can self-regulate. And in my case, I do it by meditation. But I want to do it before I go into that dysregulated state, before I get whatever it is that
Being a step ahead.
Thank you. And so I begin to learn to read the signs. Now, let me tell you that if any of my group are listening to this, they are keeled over in laughter now. I'm the worst person when it comes to doing this. I will ignore, I will suppress, and I will pay the price. And I have paid the price.
Okay.
But life is a constant learning experience. Now, I tell this story in one of the books about, my wife is in the hospital. I've got a little baby girl that can't fall asleep. I've got now a 3-year-old on the spectrum. I'm driving 160 kilometers, I don't know what that is in miles, back and forth to the hospital. And I finally got my wife, I finally got my daughter, my baby girl, asleep. And my little boy comes in, my autistic kid, and he asks for a glass of milk, which wakes up the baby. And I pick up my boy and I throw him. We had this huge puffy seat, and I throw him and he looks at me and he's gone into shock. And he says to me, "It's okay, I'm not really very thirsty." But okay, so I go back through it, and there are a lot of trauma in my family, and I was just doing what my father had done to me, and all you can do when that happens is just say, "I'm sorry." will you forgive me? Um,
Yeah.
uh,
I tell my toddler, I'm sorry, when he was 1,
oh,
and
that's
nothing else
great.
was sorry. He
Oh, I
knows
love it. I just love it. I love it.
he knew sorry before the word, sorry.
Okay, so anyways, the point is when we talk about self-reg, the emphasis is on self.
So, and I want to kind of circle back to my original sort of interest in uh, Coletti's 1883 Pinocchio, and bringing it back to sort of parents and doing what you're doing right, if you're doing something right or wrong. Parental guilt also is a
Yeah,
factor, and I think you've mentioned this in your book, sort of like that's guilt circuit sort of has further negative consequences, right?
yes.
um, if you could sort of touch on that and your chapter where you talked about children who will confabulate, um,
Oh,
and
geez.
parents wanting to discipline them, and parents feeling guilt and shame for why their children are not behaving right. Kind of the theme of guilt that kind of just gets in the interbrain, you know, as in the and using Pinocchio and Geppetto as a theme. The real story of Pinocchio, not the Disney one.
Well, mind you, there is that new film. I was very curious to see it. If he
I
tells
just
it,
saw it.
and
It is much more thorough than the Disney version.
okay, so is it okay if I let people go read it because they're in for surprise?
Oh,
Um,
sure.
the story's not quite what you thought it was. Um, um, and it's
You
Geppetto.
mean Coletti's
Yes,
1883? Yes.
yes. Um, so let's make this the last thing for today, okay? Because I'm getting tired.
Sure.
We teach our kids. Let me do it in terms of a psychology experiment. Okay, this is one of the great experiments that was done in 1977. And it's really the background to Kahneman's Think Fast, Think Slow, it's to so much to what we learned today. So what Nisbet and Wilson did was they had 4 identical pairs of stockings. And the subjects were asked to choose one. And so what they found is there's what's called a position bias. With 4 identical items, you always choose the last. And then they interviewed so everybody's choosing the last pair of stockings, but there's no difference between them. So when they interviewed the subjects afterwards, they said, well, why did you pick that pair of stockings? So the answer was no reason. I just did, but everybody had a reason. Everybody, and they would say, well, this one had a better weave. The dye was better. Like they would make it up, confabulate. So then Nisbet and Wilson would say, well, there's actually this thing called a position effect. And what we find is that everybody just chooses the last one. Oh, well, that may be true for everybody else, but not for me. I did it because we want to see ourselves as conscious, rational, whatever.
In control of our thoughts.
In control. Love it. Talk about a ghost in the nursery. Okay. We start asking a kid why as soon as they start to speak. So, why did you hit your sister? Why did you, whatever? And so the kid learns very early to confabulate. The kid learns to, come up with a reason, come up with any reason so that you stop yelling. So the truth is, the kid doesn't know why he hit his sister. Really doesn't. The kid doesn't know why he got in trouble at school. I think of all the times that my son got in trouble, the older one, he didn't know. He just knew he was in trouble. And so he starts to manufacture a story. So there's a case that I describe in, I think it's in this 2016 book, Self-Reg. We got called in for a teenage boy, and he had said something inappropriate, sexually inappropriate, and he was in the principal's office. And the parent begged us to come because they were about to expel the kid. Okay. So I don't know what the kid said. He's 13 years old. It doesn't matter. So so they're all standing. You gave this example about floor time where we're going to get down on the child's level because it's very threatening for a child to have an adult looming over you. So the kid's in the chair and they're all standing around him, yelling at him. And the kid keeps on saying, I don't care. So the punishment keeps on escalating. First, he was going to have a detention, then he was going to be suspended. Now they're at the point where he's going to be kicked out of the school and he'll have to, his parents have to find him another school. And to all of this, the kid keeps on saying, I don't care, which made them nuts.
Angry.
And when I walked in, the vice principal is saying to the kid, well, you better care, mister, in this loud, threatening voice. So the last thing the kid really means is I don't care. I don't care is what we call limbic utterance. And so all he's trying to do is make the stress stop. And so for us, confabulation is really the child's attempt to make the stress stop. Now, the point of the exercise was for him to learn that it was inappropriate what he had said. That's all they wanted. Instead, they had taken a minor incident and turned it into this crisis. So we did actually what you said at the very outset. So I asked them to turn off the lights, everybody sit down, everybody take a deep breath. All we want to do is get this kid back, turn off the kid's alarm, get that kid back into homeostasis. That day was not the day to talk to him about sexually inappropriate language. We'll wait.
Right. Post-reflection.
Exactly. And as it turns out, the kid was a friend of my son. I knew the kid. He's a sweet kid. He's just trying to impress the other boys.
Sure.
Yeah, it was nothing thing. So, but then I thought, as I was writing that chapter, how many times have I done it? How many times have I had that threatening voice? Why did you do that? Well, of course, if I say it in that way, he's going to confabulate. And so
it's a defensive reaction.
Exactly. Okay, so
but parents have a really hard time understanding that. Some parents get very angry at lying, and it just escalates.
Okay, so they got to read the chapter and reframe lying.
Yes.
It's not. Anyways. Sure. So let me close by saying, I love what you're doing.
Thank you.
I went through it carefully. I love that you taught me about this.
Thank you.
And it's a time for everybody to take home one message from today. I've learned one thing. I've done this my whole adult life now, and I've learned one thing, and I'll share it. There's no such thing as a bad kid. Ever. I mean, you have to believe that. You have to internalize it so that the child internalizes it, so that the child doesn't leave thinking I'm a bad kid. And then you can change trajectories. And, you made another interesting remark at the beginning. I don't want to project for my kids. I want my kids to discover what makes them happy, to discover meaningful relationships. And if they can find that, I think I've done my job.
Good enough.
Good enough.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shanker.
You're welcome, Sandy.
It's nice having you, and I hope that we can have you back.
Okay. Keep it up.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.